about the strategy or discussions about strategy in Europe. It's clear that we are confronted with a huge neoliberal offensive in Europe as well as in other parts of the world to make the population pay for the crisis. In Europe, in this offensive, not only the states but also the European Union plays a very important role. So, discussing our strategy, I think it's important to take into account the different roles of the national states in Europe and the role of the European Union. In that way, even a better image of the role of the European Union. Of course, when we talk about Europe, we have to take into considerations that there are a lot of differences between different European countries. A lot of difference in culture, tradition, languages spoken, difference between EU member states and non-member states, between new and older member states, between states in the Eurozone and outside, etc. But in some way or the other, they are all confronted with the same European Union. Therefore, I think it's crucial to understand the relationship of the European Union with the bourgeois states. First of all, I think it's important to understand that the European Union is not some kind of power above the existing states. The national states, the governments of the national states, have always the last say inside the European Union. Of course, the stronger the economies of the state is, the more they have to say. It's clear that Angela Merkel has much more to say in the European Union because of the economic strength of Germany than smaller states. But even small states inside the European Union can say no if they wanted to. The problem is not that they can say no, the problem is that they don't want to say no. Because the European governments has always the last say in European politics. Herman did great work explaining the structure of the European Union, the different organs and the way decisions are taken. Probably not all of you have now the idea that they totally understood. I would say don't worry, because that's one of the fundamental characteristics of the European Union, that decisions are taken in a way that it's very, very difficult for ordinary people to understand where decisions are taken, who taken the decision and on what basis. Even some people say that is the purpose of this kind of structures. Structures who make it unable for ordinary people to understand why and how decisions are taken. If you look at a normally parliamentary democratic situation, thank you. You've got a politically composed government and you've got some kind of opposition. So as ordinary citizen, more or less, you can see what is the political line of the government, what is saying the opposition, which parties are inside the government and which parties are in the opposition, and you can make some kind of adjustment and calculate that in vote in the next election. In Europe this is very different. European decision making looks more like a big melting pot where someone puts something in, it's turned around and there comes something out and it's not very clear who took the decision. You see that process very clearly, I think, with a European summit. On the European summit, all the governmental leaders of the European countries met. After closed doors, they took a lot of decisions, and afterward, everyone gives normally a separated press conference where they explained that they fought for the interest of their own country, of their own peasants, workers, etc., etc., and they gained as much as possible from it. So from all the participants of came the same story. It was a big success for our country, etc., etc. We think governments, after some time, has to implement the decisions they took among each other. And normally you get a whole different story. Then the same people are explaining we have to take rather tough measures because it was a decision of Europe or because Brussels said so. That's why Brussels has got, for a lot of people in Europe, a very bad name. The image of some kind of power center from which comes a lot of bad things. But never forget that these decisions, the main decisions, are taken by the governments, and the governments are able to say no if they want to. So it's a way of hiding behind European decision making to avoid political responsibility for these kind of decisions. In our attitudes towards the European Union, I think we have to avoid two things. First of all, any kind of reformist illusion. The idea that Europe is not democratic, but with the next treaty it will be a little bit more democratic. Europe is not social, but with the next decision it will be a little bit more social, etc., etc. I think these illusions are just totally confronted of the whole structure and functioning of the European Union, and even with the main of the functioning European Union for the bourgeois powers who control it. The second thing we have to avoid is any nationalist or particularist attitudes, which means the idea that without the European Union, or if we leave the European Union, or if we leave the Eurozone, everything is solved. You've got a lot of analyses explaining the bad role of the European Union, explaining that it's a neoliberal project, that the Euro is a neoliberal project, and drawing the conclusion that because of that we have to get out of it. That's not always a logical conclusion. You know, if you sit in an aeroplane, you can after some time come to the conclusion, even altogether come to the conclusion that you are in the wrong aeroplane. But it's not necessarily the best decision to leave the aeroplane at that moment. That is the same situation, I think, with the Euro and the European Union. So to avoid reformist illusions and any kind of nationalist or particularist responses. Of course, these two approaches, reformist illusion and nationalist illusions, so to say, fuel each other. In the whole debate about Europe, there's a big tendency to say, if you don't accept this European Union, if you don't believe to make this European Union stronger and step by step make it more democratic, etc., etc., then you're supporting nationalist currents or are against the European Union. The whole idea that everybody who is against the existing European Union must be a nationalist, etc., etc. So these two tendencies make themselves more, each other more strong. So we have a vote both of this, and that's makes it complicated. Let's take as example the campaign against the European Constitution, especially in countries where there was held a referendum, France and the Netherlands. In both countries, we played a certain role in this campaign. And we didn't hold a campaign for, let's say, the Socialist Federation of Europe or something abstract like that, like some other left-wing organization did say. No to the Constitution, but we have to build a socialist Europe, etc., etc. Neither did we campaign against Europe, only explaining we are against Europe, and without Europe and without the Eurozone everything would be better. Neither a campaign explaining that this constitution was a step forward in democratization, we have to go further, etc. We based our campaign explaining clearly against this constitution, not because it was a step further in forming an undemocratic neoliberal Europe, but it was more or less fixing the existing undemocratic neoliberal Europe, explaining that we were in favor of Europe, of European cooperation, etc. And because we were in favor of Europe, European cooperation, we need a more democratic Europe, not a neoliberal Europe, etc. I think by this approach we were able to reach a broad audience and to play a certain role in this campaign, and to have a lot of very interesting discussions about neoliberal politics, about the function of Europe, and about our perspectives. Okay, we're not going to talk about what happened after 2005 with the Constitution, because that's another story. It's clear that we are now in a totally different situation. We have to fight back against an offensive of capital, of bourgeois governments, and of the role played in this offensive by the European Union and its institutions. For this fight back, we need, of course, some instruments who for a big part don't exist or are much too weak. I think first of all, I'm going to mention three instruments we need. First of all, we need some programmatic understanding of the situation. Let's say an eco-socialist program. That's not obvious for anyone. A lot of people who are engaged in this fight back against the bourgeois offensive have got another perspective than our eco-socialist perspective. So it's not always an easy discussion explaining people that discussing the crisis, we're not looking forward to restart production, restart consumption, get the whole machine working as it worked before. That we have to, even beside the discussion if that's possible to restart the machine in that way, put very much emphasis on the ecological aspects. So we're discussing about the whole transformation of the functioning economy, everything that is implicit in that. Okay, of course that's another topic of this week, but it's important to work on that much more than we did until now. So first point, a programmatic eco-socialist program and the consequences for the fight against the crisis and the crisis program. Second thing we need is some common European instruments. There are some meetings, coordinations, initiative, etc. But until now they are very weak. We've got the European Social Forum, we've got the after summit, common activities as Occupy, etc. Some European or more or less European-wide social organizations like ATTAC and Euromars and things like that. But with all the problems, they have to be built and coordinated much more than they are now. Because the main weakness, I think, is on the trade union level, where we got a very bureaucratized European coordination of trade unions, who is a lot of times much more a stop or a frame on developing the struggling than stimulating that. That is a very big weakness of the situation that we have to struggle to overcome. And thirdly, we need to develop out of all of this common goals, slogans, etc. for a more united European struggle. One of the interesting debates we had the last time in Europe was about Greece, and especially about the discussion about leaving or not leaving the Eurozone. Of course, this debate around Greece was most developed because in Greece it was the only country where there was a real possibility of a left government with Theresa and Olaf forces. So there was the real possibility of an alternative national policy which posed the problem of your attitude towards Europe and the Eurozone. In that debate, which was led in, and I think all of the European left, there were put forward three positions. The first position was just out of the euro. It was more or less, as I described before, an analysis of the euro and European Union as a neoliberal project, with the conclusion it's a neoliberal project, it's wrong, so we have to get out as fast as possible. The second position was not always so clearly expressed. A lot of times more was that it was more or less the contrary position. A vote getting out of the euro, because isolated you are nothing. You can't take steps against the authority, the austerity measures against the Troika, because you take the risk of getting out of the euro zone. So implicitly you have always to bow in front of the European measures. The third position was defended by at least a big part. It was defended at least by a big part of Syriza, was to say clearly no to austerity measures, no to the Troika, without saying we are leaving in the Eurozone, but in a certain way take the risk that you would be, if you were in the possibility to continue that policy, be kicked out of the Eurozone. We didn't reach in reality this point of forming a left government who took these measures, but even that I think it was a very interesting and good debate about your attitude towards the Eurozone. And I think this third position had two benefits. It opened the discussion of the role of the European Union, of the Troika, and the role of the euro, and at the same time it gives a possibility for broader European-wide mobilizations, because it would be a different situation if a left government in Greece would say, okay, we step out of the Eurozone and the euro and leave it to you to solve the other problems, or you had the left government should say, we don't agree with these measures, we don't pay back part or the totality of our debt. We don't accept the dictates of the Troika, but we don't want to get out of the euro, so if you want to get out, you have to kick us out. That would be a base of broader mobilization also, and discussion and mobilizations also in other countries in Europe about the same prospect and the same possibilities, and to make some kind of united front. Next page, but it will be very short. Besides this programmatic and strategic considerations, of course, we also can look to more concrete demands, and I think we should discuss them more in detail. Of course, I just going to list some of them. Of course, the struggle against cuts and austerity is the starting point of our situation. At the same time, struggle for investments in public works, green jobs, isolating housing, transformation to a green economy, etc. Which opens the debate, as I said before, about growth, the importance of growth as such, which kind of growth, etc. It means a whole discussion about our economic socialist program and things like that. Third, I think very important point would be the amount of another tax regime. As Herman explained, there has been a shift of 10% from the working class in gross national product, from the working class to capital, because of the changes in the last 30 years in the tax regime, in which the capital is less taxed, the working force more. All know the discussions about the tax havens, etc., etc. So I think the discussion about tax and what tax means and what can be done by different kinds of tax will be very important. So highly progressive taxes, more taxes to business, things like that. Financial transaction tax. Fourth point would be the reduction of working hours without loss of pay. It's a very old demand, who is strangely enough in this crisis not very much put forward, but it's totally unrealistic to say in nearly all the European countries. At one side you see a huge level of unemployment of youth, and at the same time development in the direction of people has to work longer hours a week, pensions at a higher age, etc., etc. I think the demand of reducing working hours and working time is very important. Of course, without use of papers and complications. Then, of course, we can develop a lot of demands, especially regarding the position of women, who are, as in every crisis, hit very hard because a lot of time are the first fired. They get all the burden of the breaking down of social services, etc. And even a high rate of aggression against women, etc. So I formulate concrete demands on that level also. Then we got the whole discussion about the debt, the need of audits of the debt, with people's participation, not accepting the debt because it is said you have to pay that amount of money in the country, but investigating where this debt came from, how many corruption was involved, who took the decisions, who were responsible, what was the role of different commercial firms, etc., etc. So a real investigation into the structure of the debt, the amount of the debt, not only by specialists, but by people's control in some kind of form. And the leading of that process was close to the conclusion that if debts or part of debts are illegal, there's no reason to pay back. You can take a comparison with, let's say, in a national situation. If I lend an amount of money to someone, and after some years he can't pay it back, I think in a normal capitalist way you start a discussion. Is that person able to pay it back? Was it responsible for me to lend such an amount of money, etc., etc.? This same kind of norm should be applied to international norms, which is not done at this moment. Let's say when you've borrowed something, you have just to pay it back without any discussion. So we have to open, by all this discussion, not always open this whole discussion. Another point is, of course, the position of the financial sector and the need of control of the financial sector. Not only the failing banks, because partly failing banks like in countries in the Netherlands, failed banks were nationalized, but we're now in the process of discussion of putting them back on the markets. From one of our most important banks, there was paid more or less 30 billion euros to save their bank, and now we're in the process of discussion of putting it back into the market and getting a price of 15 billion in reverse. Because this is a totally crazy situation. Everybody agrees that the banking system in Europe is not sane, or not yet sane, as they say. And then privatizing banks is totally stupid. And we have to fight for the other way around. You know? Get the whole financial sector under control, and that is functioning in resolving the needs of the people, not only with the criterion of making the biggest gains as possible, but playing the social. So this whole kind of discussion about the financial sector, and even other sectors. If you look to the energy sector, you can get the same kind of discussion, because a lot of firms in the energy sector even are too big to fail as like this system banks. The last point is the whole discussion about Europe, the need of another Europe. What not only means another policy of Europe, but if we're talking about another Europe, it means another Europe with other institutions, democratic institutions, working for our interests than existing European Union, and formed on another base. So we always call it a refoundation of Europe based on our interest and our functioning, and based on a constitutional assembly of any kind, elected by people. So if we're talking about another Europe, it's not the idea of reforming the existing European Union, but putting something instead of it, which has got another function based on something else. And of course, it would be a very huge struggle to get it. I think with this kind of demands, we must try to combine the social and economic struggle against the bourgeois offensive in the framework of the crisis, with an internationalist perspective and an eco-socialist perspective. I think that is the main aim, to combine three elements.